In a blizzard, too much air kills you. Too little air kills you too. That hard fact defined survival for native families across the Great Plains and the forests of the Northeast. Seal a shelter too tight, and smoke from the fire would choke everyone inside. Leave it too open, and the freezing draft would steal body heat until sleep became death. This was not guesswork. It was not luck. It was tested engineering, ancient reliable design passed down through generations. So how did they do it? How did people balance air heat and moisture well enough to sleep through nights at 40 below inside a tipi or a longhouse? In this episode, we'll break it down with 7 principles of survival: wind shielding, controlled airflow, and convection radiant heat, from fire and body's insulation against the cold ground, moisture management, reliable fuels when wood was scarce, and the way sleeping arrangements were organized. 2 shelters, 2 designs, 1 deadly problem, and 2 proven solutions that still make sense today. From the outside, a plains teepee looked simple, a cone of poles covered in hides. But the design was far more than simple shelter. It was a wind-tested structure refined by centuries of living in a landscape where blizzards could kill the unprepared in a single night. The cone shape mattered. Snow-laden winds did not slam against a flat wall. They split, sliding up and around. And the smoke flaps at the top were not decorations. They could be lowered toward the storm side, acting like adjustable wings. Point them correctly, and you block the driving draft while still letting smoke escape. That was not guesswork. It was proven field engineering, the kind of detail that kept families alive. Inside the system became even smarter. Tipis used liners, inner cloth, or hide panels that ran waist-high around the lower walls. At first glance, they seemed like decoration or extra insulation. In truth, the liner created a hidden chimney. Cold air entered through the gap at the bottom, rose between the outer wall, and the liner warmed and carried smoke upward. The result: fresher air near the floor, less draft across the sleepers, and far less choking smoke under the peak. Above, families often stretched an ozon, a secondary ceiling made of hide or cloth. Think of it as a false ceiling in a modern cabin. Instead of letting warm air rush out, the ozon trapped heat over the sleeping area, creating a smaller, warmer pocket under the larger cone. It was elegant engineering channel. The air block the draft, hold the heat, but a shelter was only as strong as its ground seal. At the base, people pulled down a skirt of hide and packed snow or earth around it. This created a berm, sealing the cracks against low-level drafts. Today, campers know the misery of a cold breeze slipping under a tent floor. Plains families solved that centuries ago with a skirt and snow berm. And yes, the doorway had a flap. People didn't leave the entrance wide open. At night, that flap was tied closed, locking out the wind. Viewers often ask, didn't the teepee just blow open? No. The flap was there, and it was shut, especially in storms. At the center burned a fire, but not the kind of roaring blaze Hollywood shows. A big fire filled the cone with smoke and sparks. The people used coals, embers, and a modest flame carefully managed. Embers radiated steady heat, reliable through the night. Safety mattered. Never build a bonfire inside a teepee. And here's a safety tip still true today. Never put river stones in a fire. Moisture inside those stones turns to steam. The rock can explode like a grenade. Plains people knew this and used only dry stones if they needed thermal mass. Fuel was always a challenge. On the Great Plains, timber was scarce. Families relied on buffalo chips, dried bison dung. Light one, and it burned slow, steady, with far less smoke than green wood. Field-tested, reliable, a survival fuel when nothing else was available. In a blizzard that mattered more than romance. They also practiced heat banking. Before sleep, coals were raked and covered with a layer of earth or broken pottery. Under that blanket, embers survived the night. In the morning, a few breaths and a handful of tinder brought the fire back. Anyone who has camped knows the pain of relighting from scratch. Plains families engineered a system that saved both effort and fuel. But shelter and fire alone were not enough. The ground itself killed. A body lying on frozen soil bleeds heat faster than most people imagine. That is conduction, the earth stealing warmth. So they built insulation. Thick mats of grass bark or woven fibers covered the ground. Over that, hides and furs. Lying on bare dirt was unthinkable. The first layer always blocked conduction. On top came buffalo robes layered for maximum insulation. Bedrolls made of hides were shared, and clustering was common. When bodies shared radiant heat, survival chances rose. The idea was not romantic. It was physics. And then there is the old phrase, a three-dog night. People joked that on the coldest nights, you needed 3 dogs in bed to stay alive. Humor aside, dogs did sleep close, and their body heat mattered. For families in a tipi, clustering humans and animals turned physics into survival. Moisture was another enemy. Even in a sealed cone breath, released liters of water vapor through the night. If trapped, that vapor condensed, turning hides wet, and wet hides meant cold hides. The solution: keep the smoke vent just open enough. A small draft let moisture escape. The principle was the same as in modern cabins: vent or freeze. Clothes and hides also had to be managed. Wet garments were draped near the warm air path, never across the chimney flow. Blocked the smoke channel and you suffocated. Dry strategically and you survived. Taken together, the tipi was not a simple tent. It was a survival machine refined by generations. Every part cone, chaff smoke flaps, liner, ozone skirt, fire management, fuel, bedding, moisture control was tested in storms that punished mistakes with death. This was ancient engineering at its best, reliable, proven, and perfectly adapted to the land. And the lessons still hold. If you camp today, you'll see the same principles: wind shielding, controlled convection, insulation, moisture control reappearing in modern gear. The difference is, Plains families had mastered them centuries before anyone wrote them down. The Iroquois and their neighbors in the woodlands of the Northeast built something very different from a teepee. Where the plains required mobility, forests allowed permanence. The result was the longhouse, a wooden structure that stretched from 60 to 200 feet, covered in sheets of bark, with multiple families living under one roof. In a winter blizzard, the longhouse was not just a home. It was an engineered survival system. The frame was a lattice of poles bent and lashed into an arched roof. Over this, sheets of elm or other bark were tied layer upon layer. The walls were not thin skins, but thick panels that blocked the direct bite of the wind. At each end, the builders often added a small vestibule. Think of it as an entry hall. When the main door opened, the vestibule absorbed the gust, reducing the blast of air into the living space. In storms, that vestibule was the difference between comfort and misery. The roof itself carried smoke holes at regular intervals. They were not left wide open. Mats and bark covers could be slid or lifted, adjusting the draft according to wind direction. This flexibility made the longhouse adaptable to changing conditions. When the snow fell heavy, a family could tighten the cover. When smoke gathered, they opened it. It was a system of vents, primitive in appearance, but effective in practice, not unlike the adjustable chimneys in later European cabins. Inside the heart of the survival system was fire, but unlike the single hearth of a tipi, a longhouse contained many hearths placed along the central aisle. Each hearth served 2 families, one on each side. Fires were kept modest, not raging. Small, steady flames produced less smoke and more manageable heat. With a row of hearths, the entire interior gained warmth. Families cooperated, feeding the fires in sequence, maintaining a rhythm of shared heat. This was community engineering survival scaled up to dozens of people. Airflow was guided deliberately. Along the walls hung mat skins or woven partitions. These acted much like the liner in a tipi. Cold air entered low rows with heat and was funneled upward toward the smoke holes. The mats created convection channels, keeping the air moving, preventing stagnant smoke from filling the rafters. What looks today like decoration was in fact a proven ventilation system. The ground itself was carefully managed. No one lay directly on frozen earth. The floor was lined with layers of grass, bark, and hides. Over this, raised platforms were built along the walls, serving as beds. By sleeping above the cold ground layer, families avoided the worst of heat conduction. Anyone who has camped knows the difference a raised cot makes. The Iroquois built theirs centuries earlier out of necessity. Above each bed, curtains were hung hide or woven mats that enclosed the space. These bed curtains created a microclimate. Instead of trying to heat the entire cavernous longhouse, families heated small enclosures. Inside, radiant body heat accumulated and drafts were reduced. The same principle later appeared in Europe with curtained four-poster beds. Once again, ancient engineering converged on the same solution: conserve heat close to the body. Fuel was different here than on the plains. Wood was abundant in the Northeast. Families burned hardwood bark and charcoal. They managed fires, carefully adding fuel slowly to avoid excess smoke. Wet clothing was hung above the hearths where rising warm air dried it. Placement mattered. Block the draft and smoke poured sideways. Hang it correctly and both clothes and air cleared efficiently. One principle never changed: moisture had to escape. A longhouse sealed too tight became a freezer inside. Breath, sweat, and cooking vapor condensed on bark walls, turning to frost and dripping back. The builders knew this. They never sealed the smoke holes completely. A house needed to breathe just as the people did. Controlled ventilation meant survival. Taken together, the longhouse was more than shelter. It was community technology. Each feature, the bark sheathing the vestibule entry, the adjustable smoke holes, the sequence of hearths, the wall mats, the raised beds, the curtains, the careful use of fuel formed a system. And in the dead of winter, that system kept dozens of people alive under one roof. This was not trial and error. It was tested design refined by centuries. In Europe, similar solutions appeared: stone cottages with chimneys, raised beds with curtains, entry halls to block drafts. The Iroquois and their neighbors reached the same conclusions with the materials their forests provided. The logic was universal shield. The wind guide the airflow, insulate the body, control the moisture, manage the fire. Survival is engineering, whether in woodlands or plains. When we step back and compare the tipi of the plains with the longhouse of the Northeast, 7 survival lessons stand out. They are not random tricks. They are principles tested, proven, and still relevant for anyone facing extreme cold. First, wind shielding. The plains tipi used its aerodynamic cone with smoke flaps lowered toward the storm, splitting the draft. The longhouse relied on vestibule entries blocking the blast of cold air each time the door opened. Both designs show the same rule: stop the wind before it steals the heat. Second, controlled convection. The tipi used its liner and ozone to guide airflow, creating a chimney effect. The longhouse used wall mats, channeling air toward the smoke holes. In both cases, airflow was managed, not left to chance. That is real engineering control. The draft, don't fight it. Third, radiant heat. Small, steady fires produced embers that radiated long-lasting warmth. Families clustered close, and in longhouses, bed curtains enclosed body heat in a microclimate. The principle is the same in physics, textbooks: radiation, warm surfaces, not just air. Fourth, insulation from the ground. Frozen soil drains body heat fast. Both shelters used thick bedding layers, grass mats, bark, and hides. The longhouse raised beds off the floor. The tipi relied on heavy furs. Either way, contact with cold ground was blocked. Fifth, moisture management. Wet equals cold. The tipis left a vent open at the peak. Longhouses never sealed smoke holes completely. Ventilation prevented condensation from icing the interior. It was a balance: tight enough to stay warm, open enough to breathe. Sixth, safe and reliable fuel. On the plains, buffalo chips burned long with little smoke. In the forests, hardwood and bark kept fires steady. And one safety tip remains unchanged: never use wet river stones. Trapped moisture can turn them into grenades. The people knew this centuries ago. Seventh, sleeping arrangements. Families did not scatter across a cold room. In tipis, they clustered under firs. In longhouses, they built raised beds with curtains. Heat was shared, conserved, and multiplied. 7 lessons: shield the wind, guide the air, use radiant heat, block conduction from the ground, vent the moisture, burn safe fuels, organize the sleepers. Together, these principles made survival at -40 possible. So now the question comes to you: if the blizzard struck tonight, would you choose the tipi with its liner and ozan, or the longhouse with its hearths and curtains?